Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the latest edition here on RNFM Radio. You're tuning in to episode 119. This is being recorded on June 24th, but we are also live here on Google Hangouts on air. And where else are we? We are on the Pulse of Nursing. This is the leading platform for nurses, and we're thrilled to have you tune in for the latest news, trends, and hot topics in the world of healthcare and our nursing leaders and thought provokers in our industry. Welcome. I'm Kevin Ross. I'm here in my studio, and of course, I want to welcome my co-host here, co-pilot and rock star again. Yes, that is again rock star. Keith Carlson is here with us today. Keith, how are you today, sir?
I'm good, Kevin, and that rock star stuff's really going to my head, so you got to really be careful, okay? Just don't overdo it too much every week, or my head's going to get too big for the screen here. But I'm doing fine. Great to see you, Kevin. I always look forward to these hours with you here on RNFM Radio, and like you said, it's episode 119, believe it or not. So why don't you give your little extra spiel about how to find us and get in touch, and then I'm going to introduce our very amazing guest.
Well, how you should get in touch, you should head over to rnfmradio.com. That is what's what and where is where, or who is who, over about our guest and, of course, Keith, myself, and everything in between. We also are under the hashtag RNFM Radio, so follow us at RNFM Radio or that hashtag RNFM Radio. That is cross-platform, and what I mean by that is Facebook, Twitter, Google Plus, YouTube, you name it, that's where we are because we are everywhere you want to be. And speaking of our audio podcasts, you can find us over at iTunes under the RNFM Radio section there, or just search RNFM Radio under iTunes. We're on Stitcher Radio and TuneIn Radio, and of course, we can't, of course, forget, always, always, always so thankful to be a part of the ProMed Network at promednetwork.com/RNFM Radio. And we're today live right now on Google Hangouts on air. So if you follow our YouTube channel, RNFM Radio Show, or our Google Plus page, RNFM Radio Show, then you will know, or you will at least find us and see us here live, usually on Wednesdays, but today is Tuesday. So we send those links out via all of our social media platforms so that you know where we are. And of course, you can leave us a voicemail or text us at 720-466-3022. And of course, as always, we'll give you a roundup of the upcoming guests toward the end of the show and any housekeeping issues that we need to discuss. And as always, I'm going to hand the mic back to my co-host, Keith Carlson, and he's going to introduce our awesome sauce guest today.
All right, thanks, Mr. Ross. So today we are very, very honored to welcome Rita Batchley. She's not your ordinary RN. She's a teacher, author, and speaker who happens to believe that nurses hold the key to real healthcare reform. How about that? Since graduating from nursing school over 28 years ago, Nurse Batchley has helped to deliver more than 3,000 babies, and now in her breakout novel, Labor Pains, which I happen to have right here, she delivers a gripping story that breathes life into the spirit of nursing. This timely story is sure to be loved by today's nurses as well as those yearning to be delivered into a world where the primary ingredient in medicine is caring. As the nurse's nurse, as she's very widely known on social media, Rita has dedicated her life to support nurse-to-patient ratio laws, and she tells the effects of nursing on nurses as only someone with her experience can really do. She contributes essays and editorials by way of her blog at thenursesnurse.com, and she's dedicated her life to support those nurse ratio laws, and we will be talking about that. Now let me just say something about Labor Pains. I'm going to hold it up here. Labor Pains recounts a timely story sure to be loved, like I said, by today's nurses, but even those who aren't nurses who really want to understand what nurses' lives are like. The main character, Paige O'Neill, is a labor and delivery nurse who works at Mercy Hospital, and she watches the mysteries of childbirth unfold. This is a community hospital that's been swallowed up by a larger corporation, something many of you might be able to relate to out there. And it's really a story of how she survives, how Paige survives, and the hospital itself in the midst of all of these struggles in the corporate healthcare system. So Rita did an amazing job on this book. I highly recommend it. And Rita Batchley, I welcome you heartily to RNFM Radio.
Thank you, Keith. Likewise, Kevin.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you here, Rita. So why don't you tell us first, because 99% of our listeners are nurses as far as we know. And to those of you who aren't nurses who are listening, not to discount you in any way, but Rita, would you like to speak a little bit to that 28-year history as a nurse, where you've been, where you've come from?
Sure. I started nursing in 1986 in a little med surg unit. Well, it did a lot of different cases. So I got a great background in clinical nursing, which was great. And I left there after 3 years and went to labor and delivery, where empowering women has become my passion. And from empowering women, realized how little nurses take care of themselves, especially when it comes to negotiating for our wages, and not only that, for our working conditions.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
in 1993, I became more involved in the California Nurses Association. So it was a big political turnover at that time when nurses left. California nurses left the ANA, which I'm not sure people know that, but we have a different board of registered nurses. And we became more involved in representing the bedside nurses, which don't always have that advanced degree, which is now part of basic nursing. Most nurses, by I think the year 2018, will need a bachelor's in nursing. So it wasn't back then, and I must say that I'm happy to represent bedside nurses and what we do as far as being the front line of healthcare.
Wow. And you've been on the front line for those 28 years. And like we said in your bio, you've delivered or been part of the delivery of over 3,000 babies. So you're not talking from, you're not talking out of your hat. You really know what's what when it comes to the medicalization of birth and how things have transpired in the birthing profession or birthing industry. There are some very interesting anecdotes and stories in this book about the births that Paige witnesses and the doctor's practices that she witnesses, some of which she applauds, some of which she really abhors. So we'll talk more about Paige. But before we get to the book, in terms of your moniker, your nom de plume as the nurse's nurse, what does it mean to you to be the nurse's nurse?
Well, that's interesting because most people who ask that aren't nurses, but it does come from that political history in which nurses have been, once we rise up that ladder, we reach a certain point in our career where we forget where we came from that clinical background, from being at the bedside and in the trenches. Like, we call it the trenches. I know the nurses out there can relate to that
Mhm.
because of the way that we deal with the chaos and disorganization, and we call it organized chaos. And as the nurse's nurse, I remember where I came from, and I always want to stand up and be those eyes and ears and actually take action for the nurses, because we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to be team players, and there's a lot of things in the industry about being, nurses being bullies to the new nurses coming in, and the whole culture needs to change. And that's what the nurse's nurse is about, changing that culture, because we're dealing with a healthcare culture that is like an assembly line, not only treating patients that way, but treating nurses that way as well. Uh, a nurse is a nurse is a nurse has been one of the proverbs out there for a long time, and it's just not true.
Mhm. Right, well said. And looking at your one of your websites, ritabatchleyrn.com, it says consultant for social change, authentic purpose, and healthcare justice, promoting the growth, health, and well-being of the nursing vocation, and in being an advocate for changing the image of nurses. So what I see from what I've learned about you over these months, since I've been reading the book and reading up on you, is that the we'll get into the book in a few minutes, and the way that a lot of what you seem to do as an advocate and an activist comes through in the story. It's written into the story. So you're talking about nurses' image in the world, but you're also talking about how healthcare professionals can actually, and nurses specifically, protect their license from how would you say it here on your website? You say, oh, how to protect your license and your life from the everyday business practices of hospitals and institutions that employ nurses and provide medical services. And that's something that we also see in the book in terms of Paige, the character, trying to figure out how to protect herself when things are happening around her that really goes against her grain, either morally or as a nurse or in terms of what she thinks is best practice. So sounds like in your work as the nurse's nurse, I mean, it's a very multifaceted process that you're going through on a day-to-day basis to empower nurses. Is that right?
Most definitely. And the process continues through Paige, who is dealing with a lot of her own personal problems, but as a nurse, we are taught to put up and shut up. And that's not working anymore, as we see not only our patients suffering, but a lot of nurses going through burnout and substance abuse, where it's always been a dirty little secret that dealing with substance abuse in the healthcare profession, not only substance abuse, but any type of things that are uncomfortable to talk about, get put behind that closed door. And what I've done in Labor Pains is open that door and let you come inside and see what it is to really be in those little social cliques in the hospital and part of a family, a social clique, a bigger organization in the hospital, and then that community outside that hospital. We touch people's lives every day, and those little seeds that we plant touch other people in so many ways. And being a birthing nurse, especially, that seed, definitely, the pun is intended, is planted, and it grows from there. And those, the kids that I would see every day, that spiritual connection of being born is such a miracle. And the kids are screaming their guts out, but that's what nurses need to learn to do, is let those feelings talk amongst each other and reason out what is going on in healthcare right now, because it is huge. The reform issues have just grazed nursing when we should have been at the integral part of the reforms that are going on. And most people don't even know what we do. And that's what Labor Pains is about. Showing people what we do to advocate, not only for your health, but for your emotional, spiritual well-being as well. Because doctors are really smart, but they don't spend all the time with you in the hospital like the nurses do. And when it comes to getting what you really need on these different levels that could be very minute, it's up to the nurse to be able to spend that time with the patient. And when you're in that assembly line type of treatment, you just have to get in, get out, go to the next patient, because the staffing issues in hospitals don't address these nuances of care that nurses do know and want to improve our profession.
Well, Rita, I wanted to jump in here because, I love what you're saying as far as starting with a seed, because we feel that the fractured healthcare system as it is, and the work environment really for clinicians, for nurses especially, but for various clinicians out there, that it can seem, or it does seem, very unwieldy, and we want to affect change, but I guess a lot of us don't know exactly how we can affect change. So by starting with the seed, how do we nurture that? How do we break this all down? Because it just seems like I always talk about this unwieldy ship that we're trying to navigate, and I just, how do we do that in increments that we can handle as individuals? Because it seems like the change does begin with us internally. Is that correct?
Most definitely. And I call myself an activist because that is exactly what needs to be done. We can feel and talk, but that doesn't change what's going on in our future. The future depends on the actions that we take today. And that might be starting with a conversation about these feelings, because when we start to stuff our feelings about what's going wrong and what we're seeing in healthcare, you have to numb out. You're so physically exhausted after a job, the kinds of jobs that we do as nurses, that you have to replenish yourself in order to water that seed, cultivate that seed of activism, because it has to happen after you leave that work situation. You can talk to people in a break room, but the best way that I know of is going to conferences. We would meet in people's homes outside of nursing and discuss the issues that were going on. Of course, the union that I belong to, the professional organizations, the American Nurses Association, the National Nurses United, different organizations where you can learn so much about how to get involved. One of the ways that I intend to take this seed is by developing an app for patients and nurses where you can find hospitals and institutions that treat their nurses well, that staff appropriately, that follow a certain guideline for staffing, and that also the nurses have a high retention rate. And I'm starting to collect these surveys and develop this whole way that we can build our own network and go from there.
I love the sound of that, Rita, because ultimately it seems like nurses that do work in these larger organizations, these larger facilities, I guess maybe they feel somewhat boxed in, and the community there is within those four walls, or however many walls there are, but I just use that as an example or as a metaphor. But I love the idea of really bringing together the community of nurses and possibly other healthcare professionals, and really extending that or amplifying that communication, that thought process, that authenticity about what people are doing within their practice and how they're able to practice in certain areas, and really make that infectious and go from one institution to another. Because again, those four walls really are hard to penetrate outside of that. So it is really great to sort of bring that into a community perspective, because there are so many nurses out there, 3 million plus RNs here in the country. And I love that. And again, going back to the seed, I think that that's a great way to nurture that and have that seed grow into a seedling and then grow into whatever that is to you. So I just want to applaud that effort, because I love the fact when we talk about bringing us together as a community and uniting our voices and giving us a place to as a collective to share that and bounce ideas and say, yeah, this is going on here, this is what's happening here. Because ultimately you talk about survival mode, and I think that's just an innate piece that we as human beings have. So we go on our shift, or go to the shift, or we go to the hospital or the organization, and we just want to survive the shift. But ultimately that's not sustainable. It's just not. I mean, again, from a survival standpoint, we can do that for only so long, very small amount of time. But yeah, essentially that's just not, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't nurture our spirits, our souls, and of course, obviously transfer to the patient. I think I just went off on a tangent, so I'm going to get off my soapbox there. I just want to say how excited I am about what you're doing here as far as building the community.
Well, thank you, Kevin. And I agree, it is that seedling goes into become a tree, and we are part of the branches and the roots of that tree. babies know this when they're born. They're not quiet. They scream out what they're feeling. And nurses, it takes a lot for us to really speak up. And part of it is the fear of these large institutions. Corporations are buying up hospitals for hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. And there's no limit, like the monopolies that broke up the phone companies back in the 80s and 90s. There's no limitation on the hospital industry and soon there won't be any competition. So it's really up to the nurses within those four walls to step out and find ways to be anonymous if they have to. But hopefully, like myself, I plan on retiring from my work and to continue the job of raising this awareness. I work for public sector, which is a totally different species than the nonprofit or profit organizations. And I can't say enough about how important it is to maintain the health of the public sector hospitals that are out there, because the private industry is for profit. Even they say they're nonprofit, they are for profit, whereas the public sector has that purity of helping the community and building what I call the legitimate object of government, being doing for the people what they can't do on their own. And that is what President Lincoln said, and I totally agree that public sector hospitals have to maintain, and you could call them socialized medicine, whatever you want, but they're so important.
Right, you're right. And too bad Abe isn't here today to help speak out with his powerful voice about these issues, and I'm sure he would. And it's kind of like, in a way, that term, the captains of industry. It feels like to me the captains of industry, in a way, are holding certain aspects of the healthcare system captive, in a way. They're, like you said, it's become very profit driven, where these public hospitals really are the ones that need the help to counteract that movement. And it's interesting how in the book, which I'd like to talk about shortly, that Paige, the main character, the protagonist, despite all of her personal struggles, which are part of the story and drive the story forward, part of it is actually this whole movement towards unionizing the hospital where she works as a labor and delivery nurse. And they're literally fighting against a CEO who is incredibly corporate and profit driven, and managers who are really attempting to save their jobs by towing the line under the CEO. And then the nurses below them are really caught in a hard place where many of them are struggling to make ends meet. Like Paige doesn't want to lose her job. She has a child and a family, but also at the same time she's watching patients be harmed by the practices that are being forced upon them in the hospital. So when you talk about, Rita, when you talk about this overlaying, in a way, of activism, writing, nursing, the work you do as a consultant, can you say a little bit about any of those common themes and how they've informed who you are today at this point, especially as a newly published author?
Well, that's a good question, one that's near and dear to me. As an activist and a consultant, I again reiterate the reason I wrote the book, originally for people to know who nurses are and what we do. We're so invisible to the public, yet we're the most trusted profession. We deal with life and death every day, and behind the scenes, we're also the ones pushing back against the CEO and the machine that's trying to get that patient out the door as soon as they can. Whereas being an educator, nurses as educators and social reformers have been part of the American history since the turn of the century is when we really became active, when women's careers left the home. But as an activist myself, writing about it has been the purest way to get those feelings out, because as I said, the things that I was feeling as a nurse at the bedside, not always being able to spend that caring and touching moment with the patient, because I had to run to the next patient or the next thing to do. Then I wanted to really get into purging those feelings and getting them out and getting other nurses to identify with the same thing, that it's on a much deeper level that we perform our duties. And being an author helps me through that commonality of patient contact. So as an author, you read the story and you're now involved in that transaction that I was involved in when I wrote the story. And it becomes, as many people ask me, why did you write fiction? Fiction's really hard to sell and to get people involved. It's because of that, the way nurses deal on a day-to-day basis. We want you to take care of yourself, but we also need to get to know you, to develop trust, and to show that we care in order for people to listen about the education of how to take care of their wound or whatever it is that we're teaching them. You have to have that common draw, as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I hope I answered your question.
Well, and I was going to jump in here when we talk about leadership, and I think that a lot of what I see going on in these organizations is that most everything has been fear-driven or fear-based. So there's fear of not meeting the numbers from a shareholder standpoint, and of course the executive team. And then and they see this as a machine, and how do they drive the machine? Well, the way you drive the machine, you just gun it. You hit the gas and you go. And if you gun it harder or faster, you get there faster. But ultimately, we're not machines. There's that human disconnect. So the fear, that emotional fear, drives that huge wedge in between, I think, the hierarchy, and then there's that huge disconnect. And that's where we need to really reconnect with each other, first starting here with myself or the individual, and then hopefully branching out as our seedling grows into that tree, as you said, so that we can become infectious, so that we can communicate more effectively with our coworker, and then hopefully that gets pushed up. Andrew Lopez actually made a comment. He's watching today, and he talks about having a level playing field where the shareholder or the stakeholder in these organizations and the executive teams, and of course nurses, can all come together in a place like a forum where I think opinions can be shared, concerns can be shared with the team, because I think if the playing field is level here, then obviously nurses will be more willing to share their ideas and become more visible as a profession. Obviously, the platform needs to allow it. So, I mean, it's got to start with the nurse, but again, at that higher level, that hierarchy, it's got to be willing to accept it, and obviously not treat it as a machine.
True. There's several scenes in my book where Paige, the main character, goes into the bathroom crying and looking at herself in the mirror because she has to ground herself in the moment of what is going on, rather than getting so angry at that system that you're talking about. Because when we get into that fear that there's not enough, and we base our whole industry on profit, there just comes a point where there has to be a whole shift in that paradigm of for-profit, and how having health insurance does not give you health care. Mm-hmm. Even with the new laws being passed that you can have pre-existing conditions, well, you can get the insurance for that for you, but the insurance still doesn't have to cover that pre-existing condition. So there's a lot of misinformation out there that nurses are responsible for bringing it out. But one of the quotes that I love that you brought up is with that faith is not the absence of fear, but our ability to remain centered no matter how crazy that situation becomes. That's what the nurses do. We maintain that calm, and we tell the patient everything's going to be all right when we don't even have an idea that really, is it really going to be okay? We just fake it till we make it. We say that because we do know in reality that if everything's not okay, it's not over yet. And it does turn out okay in the end. But that the end might not come for many, many years. And you're in that situation where someone's dying, you're losing a loved one, and there's panic. And one of the CEO in my book is part of Nurses in Action, saving somebody's life. And they get to really experience firsthand what it's like to be at the bedside and what nurses really do. But it takes more action to really make that change stick. And having nurses in the same room with managers and CEOs is a start, but there has to be some kind of safety and trust. And I think that there's some time before that can happen because of the way that nurses, if they try to form a collective consciousness or collective bargaining, they get fired, they try to do a petition or any type of survey, they get disciplined for that or ostracized. And that's
intimidated.
Yes, and that's the whole culture that needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, in terms of Paige, the protagonist of the book, and I'm really fond of her in many ways, as a person, as a nurse, as a character. I'm sure she's an amalgam of many nurses you've known. You've worked in labor and delivery for 30 years, so what she goes through, the substance abuse, the issues with doctors and her fellow nurses, and trying to figure out, is unionizing the right thing? Is it not the right thing? And struggling with even her relationship with her husband, where he sees over and over how the job is chewing her up and spitting her out, and it's very distressing to him. At the same time, he recognizes her love of what she does. So can you talk to a little bit, can you say something about the vehicle of, this is fiction imitating life in a way, right? So can you talk about that vehicle of fiction in the way that you were able, very skillfully I may add, to take all these issues and weave them into the conversations and weave them into the dialogue so that you're right there with the characters, but you're also, in my mind, I was aware at the same time, like, wow, this is quite a dissertation on 21st century healthcare at the same time as being a interesting and entertaining fictional story.
Yes, I did quite a bit of research, and one of the articles was Stephen Brill's Bitter Pill, and why medical bills are killing us. That was a huge part of the literature that I use, or the statistics that I used, that woven and out of the book. As a young woman growing up, I read the Greek classic Antigone, and it was a tragedy about a woman whose brother was murdered, and she wasn't allowed, because he was disgraced, he had disgraced the government, and he wasn't allowed to be buried, and she snuck out in the night, and that meant that he couldn't go to heaven. He couldn't be at rest. So she snuck out, and she did bury his body so that he wouldn't be torn up by the vultures or whatever. And to make a long story short, I was really moved by that story. It had so much philosophy and morals, all the things that I wanted my character to bring on that hero's journey, to have that moment where, I'm not really sure about this, and who she really is. She loves her job and she loves her profession, but she doesn't like the landscape, the political landscape of not having enough nurses and the hospital being purposely understaffed in order to maintain profits. It's just, like, as you said earlier, it's not sustainable. It abuses the nurses, it abuses the patients, and more we're seeing again the history repeating itself as it did in the 90s. New grads aren't being hired, and they're saying that there are no jobs in hospitals for nurses, but yet they're predicting a 1 million plus shortfall in nursing in the next 5 years. So there's this contradictory things going on. So I wanted a vehicle that didn't bore you with statistics. I wanted to create that healthcare hero that people can relate to and root on and really understand and grasp and get involved and cry along with her. I think there's quite a few scenes in the book that could be what I would call graphically, emotionally graphic. And that being said, I think I've done my job when I can elicit those feelings in another person that they can relate to what's really going on so many levels.
Well, Rita, I actually wanted to applaud your efforts here to go the route of fiction. I think it's not only a bold move, but actually a very smart move. And what I mean by that is there are, I mean, obviously, I think as a species, as we are now, oftentimes when we're consuming media or content, we think of nonfiction or something as self-help as work, whereas fiction is more of entertainment, yet we end up coming out on the other side thinking like, wow, I really did make a connection with that character or characters. And so I think, again, a bold move, however, a very smart one that you did go that route. And speaking of which, and speaking of that connection that I think we as human beings are connecting on a fictional level with these characters and really saying, wow, that is me, or that's really eye-opening, because I think you have to take those creative aspects and really flesh that out further. But speaking of which, is this something that could potentially end up, let's say, has there been any discussion about it being on, say, the big screen and either television or a movie?
Well, I would definitely embrace that. Actually started writing this before Nurse Jackie ever hit the media, and my story is very different. You know, my character is an alcoholic, and as you said, the character I was moved the most by growing up was little Francie in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. And culturally, socially, alcoholism and drug addiction, you're so isolated. And this little girl was so brave in telling her story, and I just felt like Paige is really being brave, telling her story, because there is so much at stake of if nurses don't step up to the plate and talk about what's going on and be a part of this greater picture of reform, we're really doing such a disservice that could take decades to undo.
Right.
So that
Well,
being, go ahead.
no. Well, I just wanted to jump in here because I want to give the community an opportunity just to voice their opinions. And of course, I just wanted to call out Elizabeth Selleck, who's watching today. She just wanted to say, great interview. Has nothing to do with Keith and myself at all. It's all you, Reed. So, but the storytelling, again, the storytelling is great because it is that connection that we're all really trying to achieve here. So you definitely must be doing something right. So thanks, Elizabeth, for listening in and watching.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's always the guests. It's not really us. It's really you. So, you know, Rita, we didn't talk about this prior, and my apologies, but do you have a favorite passage or something? And we don't have to answer now. You can think about it for a few minutes. But if you have a little something you want to read to us from Labor Pains, you could do that before the end of the interview. Do you have something in mind?
I didn't have anything particularly picked out.
Okay.
It just my little poems are. I think her little mantra, Paige's mantra, is what sticks out to me the most that
Mm.
she uses throughout her, and just her her advice is to breathe. And that's part of what we tell all our labor patients. Take a
Mm-hmm.
deep breath, let it out. And with that, we're allowing spirit to come in, which is the abundance of the universe. And there are no limitations. It has nothing to do with money anymore, because all the money in the world cannot buy you another breath. So just breathe and be in
Mm.
this moment, and everything is going to be all right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that that's easily forgotten too when we are in that survival mode, which again is I feel is just not sustainable. We know it's not. We've talked about it often because essentially when you are in survival mode, you're really just kind of locked down and focused on that task. Your peripheral vision's pretty much gone. You're not seeing outside of that, and you really do box yourself in, and then you do forget to breathe. I mean, all the things that we tell our patients to
Mm-hmm.
do, we do. We forget to breathe ourselves. And I also just wanted to make a comment from an earlier discussion that you were mentioning as far as what we tell our patients or how we tell our patients about a potential outcome that we have no idea sometimes, but it's really faith driven. But we have to have faith in
Mm-hmm.
ourselves. We have to have faith in our profession. There's got to be faith that there is something good here, that wherever the ship's going, it's got to be in a good place. And if not, then we've got to figure out how to get there. There are billions of people on this planet that go in a direction based on faith alone. And I don't want to get into too much of the religious aspects, but really there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
faith out there that drive people in some direction, and hopefully it's a positive one. So I just wanted to make that point.
And at a point, it's important that we remember that there's things outside of us that we have no control of. But ultimately, the actions that we take today or don't take do drive that boat, because you can have all the prayer in the world and all the faith in the world, but if you don't actually ask for help or reach out and grab that life jacket and put it on, you're going to drown.
Right. Well, and I wanted to, Andrew had also offered up a question to you earlier on, Rita. I just wanted to touch on that as far as he's asking about one of our basic responsibilities is that of patient advocates. We talk about patient advocacy all the time. Now, do you feel that this is often against the priorities of our employers, i.e., probably this big ship or the corporation itself? Because again, there's the bottom line and there's the fear to meet the number. And so are we actually going against the grain there as advocates because maybe that slows up a process? Maybe we have to take a little bit longer, spend or rather invest a little bit more time and money in that patient.
Most definitely, in that respect of a business plan and the outcome being profits for your stockholders or profits for whatever. When you have that motive, it's definitely, no matter what you do to it, it's going to change. It's going to change the outcome, or the intention. Actually, it's the intention of how you do business. So being patient advocate, hospitals have a really, really bad track record of transparency.
Mm-hmm.
As nurses, we know what goes on behind, you don't want to get sued for slander. To step up and be that voice of advocacy for patients and nurses, it's really hard. I mean, I've been in places that, like I said, I just had to take that deep breath and say, this is bigger than me. I need to just jump in and do this. Because when we took, California, we took Meg Whitman out of her race for governor. She had over a $600 million campaign, and we took her out because nurses got together and campaigned against her. And people trust nurses. We have to believe in that. Like you said, we have to have people have that faith in nurses. It really does rest on our shoulder. It's a big responsibility, but we have to take that responsibility and use it to better healthcare, because it is when it's profit driven the way it is. And I don't really know the answer of what would make it better, honestly, but I know that the way it is right now, we're not addressing the cost of why does it cost so much to have a procedure at one hospital, and you go across the street, and I know I'm on a tangent, but you go across the street and that very same procedure is maybe $50,000 more. We're not even talking 50 cents or $50. We're talking $50,000 more. It's insane. And nurses need to speak up to this and get involved on different levels. So
That's a good point,
board.
Rita. Yeah, and I think we do talk with a lot of nurses, obviously, on this show, and Kevin and I do in our peregrinations around social media, as do you, and many of our colleagues out there. And a lot of nurses feel stretched so far in terms of their work hours, their responsibilities to their families, their education, everything else, that layering, and I can say this for myself too at various times in my life, putting one more layer of political activism on top of that sometimes feels like it'll break the nurse's back, and it's Paige. We watch Paige in the story go through her transformation of realizing, yeah, okay, so banding together with my sisters and brothers, can actually have a positive effect, and having these meetings with her fellow nurses can actually start to make everyone feel that collective power. And I think it is difficult to not convince nurses, but to help nurses to, you actually have to create the time to be able to do these sorts of things. No one's going to hand you the time on a silver platter, right, to say, bring in union negotiations. The nurses have to make a decision individually and collectively to make it happen. And I like how that's illustrated in the story, how there's backlash, and there's back and forth talk trying to figure out, okay, is this in our best interest or not? But the united voices of the nurses is very empowering to hear.
Well, because it needs to get more painful in order for people to really, once it becomes too painful, like in labor pains, you don't do anything different. You do finally, when it gets so painful and you wince, like you take that deep breath because you realize, I got to breathe. You've done something different. You have taken the action, even if it's taking an hour to sit down and write an editorial or a letter to the editor. Make it anonymous, but sign it as an RN. There's a lot of clout in that registered nurse behind your name, and the community does listen. And I know it's hard. I've had to really work hard on a public appearance and getting out there, because I do feel so strongly that if I don't speak up about the things that I'm passionate about, I'm not living the dream. And I want to live the dream, which is being connected to that higher source of abundance.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of living the dream, in terms of Paige, do you feel that there's any follow-up from the book in terms of her as a character? Do you feel that there's more to be said about her? Is there anything you'd like to share with your audience in terms of the learning that you've done through the character of Paige? Any wisdom you want to share?
Well, most definitely there is a sequel to Labor Pains, and yes, there is a point in the story, well, several points in the story that aren't completely resolved.
Mm-hmm.
As in any reform and any change, transcendence, it's never over. We're always a work in progress. So Paige has a lot more work to do as far as the change that is going on. But as for me and the original question, I believe that yeah, it's that peeling of the onion. There's so many layers to work with within the story, but also professionally to get out there and really speak to other nurses and get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, yeah, I definitely think that involvement is the key. And how do we motivate these nurses to obviously, I don't want to be crass here, but just sort of say, like, get up off their duff and say, oh, you know what, I'm gonna be part of this movement. I am gonna be part of this paradigm shift. I want change. I have to affect change. And I think, again, relating to a fictional character, identifying with someone like that, whether your book, a show, or another book that is fiction, I think certainly can help, because I think it gives us a view of maybe how the current system is, again, in a fictional way. And for the entertainment purposes, it might seem fun at the moment, but then you think, well, but I don't want to live that. I don't want to be that. I don't want that to continue. Like, again,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that, again, is that connection that is going to help us have faith in ourselves. We need to have faith in ourselves. And again, I still believe that it has to come up from higher up in an organization to help support nurses. We do need to come together on a level playing field, a platform where we can all speak and be heard. And then if we bring things to the table, then reconvene at a later date and then hopefully have some type of change or plan in effect and actually watch that unfold. Because I do feel that nurses and other healthcare professionals out there, they want change, they want to communicate that, and then they feel like it just ends up in this vacuous suggestion box that nothing
Well,
ever happens.
it's funny because the one thing I would recommend, my biggest suggestion is to remember to say, instead of things never change, which is self-defeating, things always change and it will get better, but I have to be part of the solution. And that is a big reason I wrote the book, is to look for solutions. I was actually approached to run for Congress, which I declined, but I know that nurses do need to be involved on the political field, and I've been a part of the political action committees for several organizations, the ANA, the NNU, the California Nurses Association, and our voices lobbying in Washington on the state level are huge. As I said, look what we did to Meg Whitman here. She had a $600 million, the largest campaign budget in history, and she lost. That says a lot about the power of nursing. So
Mm-hmm.
don't ever sell yourself short, nurses. We do have the ability when we set our minds to it, but don't wait until it gets too painful. Start with little sips and work your way into the big gulp, because there's patients' lives at risk and our profession at risk.
That's great. I think that's what we needed to hear, and this is a great wrap, because I think our community, it just sort of envelops everything that you were just saying throughout the whole show, and really just taking those small steps. Because remember, seeds, seedlings, and then growing into obviously the much larger tree and the branches there. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that those are great or valuable nuggets just to remind ourselves the small steps, the small wins. Start small, because again, it'll be a much larger gain on the back end.
That's right. Well, Rita Batchley, thank you so much for being here. We really encourage our readers to go out there and buy Labor Pains right here. It's The Birth Stories of Nurse O'Neill, pushing to keep the spirit of nursing alive. Definitely go out there and get it. We highly encourage you to. You can find thenursesnurse.com. That's the best place to look for Rita, correct? Rita, is that the best place for folks
Yes.
to go? Yeah.
Yes.
So try the nursesnurse.com. You can find everything you need. She is also at ritabatchleyrn.com, but it sounds like the Nurses Nurse is the best place to start. You can find her on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Google+. She's out there. She really wants to connect with you. She will have a page up on our website within a few days. Once we get all of this audio and video rendered, we'll have a page for you up there, Rita, with your beautiful photo and a picture of the book cover. So any last words before we say good afternoon, Rita?
Thank you so much. It was such a delight. I really enjoyed talking with you guys. And to the audience, I love nurses and the power that we wield.
Well, great. Thank you. We will definitely have you back. This is not your last time on RNFM Radio, Rita.
Thank you. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Rita.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
So Keith, I wanted to take this opportunity. We had Elizabeth Selleck. She had offered up another question, I believe, for Rita, but I wanted to actually take this from a business standpoint. So she asked,
Sure.
in Medicare for All, so i.e. the single payer option that we all hear about, she's asking if these prices, if they're set across the board, so if it's a level playing field based on obviously the parts of the country and inflation and whatnot, so you have to adjust for that. In that system, would the money going to CEOs and physician specialists make it to undercompensated nurses? Now, I think that's a very compelling question, because I think that if we feel, all right, well, for leveling the playing field as far as capitalism's concerned, so there's a ceiling, there's a cap on what you're going to get reimbursed for all of these procedures. Now, will then that level the playing field as far as the salaries are concerned? Here's my opinion, because I do work a lot with Medicare and Medicaid. There are lump sums of money out there for certain services. However, it really depends on how the organization positions themselves as far as the hierarchy is concerned, and the reimbursement and the profit sharing and so on and so forth. I think that it might affect it globally in some way, but I still feel that that compensation to nurses might not change all that much, because the mentality is not really changing at that higher level, at the decision-making level, and as far as the fiscal responsible leader or CEO or COO or CFO of the company. I still feel like if you get a lump sum payment, sometimes at that level, there are still the executive teams that are divvying those dollars up how they see fit. So ultimately, the biggest loss is going to be the patient.
Right. And the nurses aren't necessarily seeing that money trickle down. Trickle down economics didn't work back in the Reagan years, and it doesn't work in our current healthcare system either. And it's kind of the same in a way. It's the same. It's the same system. It's just this is how it's working in our healthcare system. So that's a good point, Kevin. And did she have a follow-up question, or did you address? Was it that one question?
I think unless she's still watching, she could certainly come in here. But yeah, I think that's what she was really asking, if we do see that happening. And you're right. The trickle down economic system is just it's not healthy. It doesn't work. I mean, I was part of that Reagan administration growing up, and nothing trickled down. It seemed like somebody turned the faucet off at our level.
Pretty much. Pretty much.
But going back to what Rita and I were waxing poetic about before is the faith. And I think that good leaders have faith in their employees, in their staff members, in their coworkers. And they themselves need to have faith that nurses mean well, and if you give nurses the ability to grow and succeed within their subspecialty or that area, then ultimately it will grow as a system, as a cohort. It really will. But I do see that there's just the absence of faith, and again replaced with fear.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and speaking of fear, in the book Labor Pains, Paige, the protagonist, she walks in fear for a large part of the book. There's the fear of her alcoholism being discovered. Then there's the fear of, in a way, fear of recovery. There's the fear of the powers that be who can take away her job at any moment because she's getting involved in this drive for unionization. And there's the general fear within the system where she works. There's the fear amongst the nurses, mostly about how they're not able to provide the care they want to provide because they don't have time, and there's the fear of losing their jobs if they don't toe the line. So, fear is a vein that runs through the healthcare system to a large extent for many people, and that's a sad statement. But it also, if we become aware that that fear is a driving force, then that does give us more power, or helps us feel more empowered to actually try to do something about it. And I do look forward to the sequel to the book because I would like to see where Rita, in her deft writing, where she decides to take the story.
Agree. And again, to her point, as she's talking about sort of the pain, and then it has to get worse before it gets better, or the pain has to get more severe, because that will certainly affect change. And then even taking a quote from what Renee Thompson talks about, when you put the frog in the boiling water, he'll jump out. But if you just put him in the water and then a slow boil, he'll just basically boil to death.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the thing. We've just become so complacent, and then that just seems what is common. It's commonplace. It's a common thought, a common thread. So we identify with it, and ultimately we know. Simply put, it sounds cliche, and it's just like, yeah, sure. This guy's just totally on a soapbox. But ultimately, you can't really affect change. You can't make something different if you continue to do it the same way over and over again. I mean,
Exactly.
you have to do it differently.
Right. Right. And I just want to share a couple words of pages. This is from page 55 in Labor Pains. And this is just about just about nursing in general. And it says, Paige changed out of her scrubs and into her street clothes. Her sigh filled the room as she bent down to loosen her shoelaces. Her feet ached in the white sneakers that were spattered and scuffed from heel to toe. Over the years she'd tried many shoes, but in a job like nursing, a pair without a sturdy sole and a sensible heel were worthless. And that's when the thought struck her, heel with sole, meaning H-E-E-L, with sole, S-O-L-E, but then she realizes that also translates to heal, like healing, with soul, S-O-U-L. She says nursing is highly skilled, but sometimes it's the little things that count the most. Offering a tired visitor a cup of coffee or rubbing a patient's sore back can be just as important as taking vital signs or checking a lab result. At the end of a long day, it's the small details, like wearing a good pair of shoes, that make all the difference in the world. How sad that the value of nursing doesn't take top priority because, technically speaking, it's the most important thing people come to the hospital for. And that little passage speaks to me a lot. First, it's Paige focusing on her own physical comfort to be able to deliver this care that she's delivering in these long 12-hour grueling shifts in L&D, but also that notion that that's what people are coming there for. Of course, they're coming for their surgery, etc., but even like Rita said during the course of the interview, or one of us said, that patients interface with us more than anyone else. And it's like you were saying, Kevin, it's small steps. Also in your patient care, just to draw that metaphor further, it's those small things that we do that add up. And when, as nurses, we feel we don't have time to hold the patient's hand, look him in the eye, take an extra minute, that's a really sad thing. And maybe that's one of the things that can drive a lot of us to try to affect change when we feel like we can't do those little things.
Well, I think this is just one, and really just to kind of drive this home, this is an opportunity for us to really go against the grain and to be different. Because as the cohort or as the collective, it can seem a little, I don't know, surly or grisly, or, just kind of just down and miserable to be a part of that cohort, and it can easily pull you down. So you just have to say to yourself, I'm just not going to be a part of that, and take that to another level and say, you know what? If I change the way that I think, if I change the way that I practice, and if I continue those small steps, eventually somebody's going to come out of that cohort and follow, and then again another follow, and then
Right.
until you just have people following that. And because ultimately when people look at that from a point of view of, wow, wait a minute, that's what it looked like? My gosh, I don't even want to go back there anymore,
Hmm.
to that dark place. I want to be
Right,
here. I'm happy
right,
here.
right. When we don't want to go back to the bad old days, and we embrace the good new days. That's important. So, folks, I really encourage you again to go over to thenursesnurse.com. Please find Rita. Definitely find this book, Find Labor Pains. You're going to want to read it because she's going to be back on again probably when the sequel's ready, or maybe before. She may have something else she wants to come talk to us about, and Rita is always a welcome guest here on RNFM Radio. And Kevin, I just wanted to say that our next live Google Hangout, like this one today, is with our dear friend Linda Bark, nurse coaching pioneer, who was just on our nurse coaching roundtable just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. She'll be live on July 9th with us at 1 o'clock Mountain. That's 3 o'clock Eastern on July 9th. Until then, we'll have some more pre-recorded podcasts coming your way, lots of great recordings, and lots of guests booking for into the fall. So, Kev, there's a lot going on and always a lot more to come and exciting things in the works. So, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. Wish you all a wonderful day whenever you happen to be listening to this conversation. And just go to rnfmradio.com. Anything you want to learn about us, our guests, or anything else related to what we do here at RNFM, that's the place. And hashtag RNFM Radio is the place to find us on all our social media platforms. So, Kevin, have a great day. I'm going to let you wrap things up and say goodbye. And it's been a great number 119.
Indeed, it has. Well, we want you all out there, the community at large, the nurses. We love and respect you, and we want you to continue to innovate and create. Continue moving that needle. That needle's got to move just a little bit, but just continue to move that needle. We, of course, want you to continue caring for yourself while caring for others, and we look forward to having you back here with us again on the Pulse of Nursing on RN FM Radio.